Dad shoved the envelope at me like he was passing off a chore. The paper scraped my palm, pay for 3 weeks of work I'd already earned, and he said, bored, "Give it here. Your sister needs new shoes for the shoot." His voice was flat, the kind that has practiced cruelty into everyday breathing. I felt a hot, stupid shame crawl through me. I had already balanced rent, grocery runs, and Mason's daycare with split shifts and overtime. I said, level. "I need that for rent." The landlords texted twice. "Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video." He sneered like it was a joke. "Rent? Your rent? Your sister's comfort is rent enough. Don't be dramatic." He didn't wait for me to answer. He grabbed the envelope with both hands and marched toward the driveway, as if the outdoor air would cover whatever he'd just done. I followed because any part of me that still believed family would demand confrontation. He turned, shoved me, and the world folded forward. My palm hit the gravel, sharp and cold, and I tasted the small metallic sting of busted skin. He pushed again, not wildly, steady and precise, until my face met the stones and the breath left me in a thin, surprised sound. Mason was on the porch, 5, small and loud in the way kids are when something terrible is simple and adult-sized. He shouted, "Dad!" and then stopped because he'd been trained into quiet by lower things. My cheeks stung from impact more than from rock. My throat burned from trying to make a sound. My mother watched from the kitchen window with her hands folded as if we were props in her morning routine. "You always misplace priorities," she said when he stood up, voice level and slow. "You think money is for you. It isn't. We hold the family line." My sister, Kaylee, stepped out with a coffee cup like she'd been waiting for curtain call. She held her phone up at an angle like she might film the end of a performance. At that moment, the 3 of them looked exactly like a jury that had been assembled to punish me for the crime of wanting my own life. I hauled myself up with gravel in my nails and spit a little blood into my hand. I could have screamed. I could have called the neighbors. I could have done whatever frantic thing a woman in that moment is supposed to do in the movies. Instead, I breathed slow, because the person I needed to be for Mason wasn't a person who flung herself apart publicly and then begged for mercy later. I wrapped the envelope tight in my fist until the paper creased and put it back in my pocket. "You're wrong," I said, and my voice didn't wobble. "I'm not giving it. I need the rent." Dad stepped closer, face red like a man who'd been told his stage directions were off. "You owe your family, Abby," he snarled. He jabbed a finger in my face, and the motion was a threat more than a touch. "You want to live alone? Fine. But don't expect this house to be your safety net when your bank account dries up." Mom nodded like a principal in full agreement. "This is character," she said. "This is how you learn to keep perspective." I left. I didn't pack anything. I didn't wail. I picked up Mason and our small duffel and walked to my car with the same calm I used to balance trays of food at the catering job. The gravel left pretty little cuts on my knees that throbbed like a slow metronome as I drove away. The engine's hum was the only sound between us. We slept in a friend's spare room the first night. Too many memories in the apartment where my cheek still hurt. Mason slept like a child unburdened by family politics, his chest gradually evening into slow breaths. I stared at the ceiling and counted things that mattered in tiny units: rent deadline, clinic calendar, daycare pickup. The list was practical. Nothing romantic, nothing dramatic, just survival. During the week, I did the shifts I had to, keeping my face composed for customers who mattered only because they paid me. When I wasn't at work, I used spare minutes to look up training programs and certifications that wouldn't require degrees, things that let you step into a position where companies trust you with approvals and authority. I didn't want a dramatic perfect ending. I wanted leverage, a job where my signature and access could matter more than any lecture my father had ever given. I signed up for a night course in billing systems and account management that started the same month. I practiced Excel formulas until my fingers remembered the pattern. I traded scraps of sleep for online modules. I turned down bars and late-night invites. People thought I was exhausted. I was. But exhaustion had a new flavor now. It tasted like preparation. Text after text arrived from Mom and Kaylee. Faux urgent pleas, shame-drenched guilt-tripping, veiled threats. We're a family. You're being selfish. You'll regret it. They flooded my phone the way vultures circle someone they know is going to collapse. I ignored all of it, letting the threads pile until their messages looked silly like stacks of unread mail. The turning point came at the small office I'd been temping at in month 3. I'd been doing frontline billing support, learning code numbers and escalation pathways. I stayed late one night to help a coworker with a nasty billing inquiry, and Martin, the senior supervisor, pulled me into an empty conference room afterward. "You have an eye for detail," he said. "You've been certifying cases that needed actually doing. We're moving you into an account clearance track. It's an authority role. It's not glamorous, but it's close to approvals." I didn't let the small, fierce beam of pride show. Inside, the plan I'd been assembling, piece by piece, snapped into something that could actually be used. I imagined, coldly and practically, what it would mean to be the person who could authorize or block lines, to be the gatekeeper for accounts that other people relied on. I thought of the way Dad had shoved me into gravel like I belonged to some archaic ledger. For the first time since he'd pushed me, I slept without the knot in my throat that had lived there for years. I still had bruises. My cheek still twinged. My bank account still had the looming threat. But there was a new arithmetic in my head, time invested, skill earned, position gained. It wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. When I walked back into the neighborhood 2 weeks later, it was with a different kind of patience. I wasn't looking for confrontation. I was looking for opportunity, a place to push the balance of power where it hurt them most, in the systems they'd always asked me to manage for free. That night, I used Mason's small hand as an anchor while I plotted logistical steps I could take without shouting. I would not expose them. I would not beg. I would build quietly and then stand, not to punish, but to finally stop being their default bank and their unpaid fixer. I slept differently then, not because something had changed in them, but because something had changed in me. I waited until Mason was asleep on the little couch, his knee tucked under his chin like a sleeping seed, before I let myself think without the constant burn of panic. The days after the push were a mechanical survival loop: work, childcare, bill juggling. But inside that loop, something else was growing, a list with names, dates, and the thin, careful notes of a ledger. I started treating my life like an evidence file. I signed up for every internal training the company offered. I shadowed people in the fraud unit even when the tasks were boring and tiny, matching account names, tracing payment trails, learning who could approve what and under which code. The things they teach you behind closed doors at a telecom were unsentimental and pure. Authorization levels, security flags, escalation reasons. I learned which keywords triggered a manual review, how long a suspension stuck in the system before you could escalate it, and how a single correctly worded entry could lock a line down for weeks until proof of identity and deposit conditions were satisfied. It became less of a job and more of a construction project. I was building an infrastructure I could use one day with surgical precision. At home, my savings grew painfully slow. I stopped eating out. I paused the therapy sessions I'd finally managed to afford because every rupee counted toward the rent that kept my son from a landlord who had no mercy. I took the late shifts at the catering company again, hands blistered, knees aching from lugging trays. I kept my face composed for strangers who tipped. The exhaustion became the steady beat beneath everything. My parents' calls changed tone when they felt me stepping away. At first, they were blunt demands. Then they were a mix of poison and flattery. The classic two-step. "We're family," Mom texted. "No one else will have your back." Kaylee sent cocktail gloss selfies with little captions that said, without saying, "We're fine. You're the one with the problem." Their messages were carefully designed to make me doubt myself, to make me hand the ledger back. I didn't hand it back. Instead, I documented. I started keeping a physical folder of their requests, screenshots, voice notes, the loan messages where Dad promised I'd get paid back in ambiguous terms. I wrote down the dates I had given them money over the years and circled patterns, emergencies that never seemed to resolve, appliances borrowed and never returned, favors that became expectations. Evidence doesn't need to be dramatized, it only needs to be consistent. There was a night when Kaylee showed up at the part-time job I worked in catering, a brazen, glamorous silhouette in the badly lit kitchen door, and she expected the old script: charm, tears, my immediate capitulation. She begged in public, voice quick and practiced. "Abby, it's an emergency. We don't have the deposit for this lease. Help us out." Everyone in the back room heard it. A few of the regulars froze, waiting for the spectacle. I rinsed a dish and let the water run until the sound smoothed my breathing. "No," I said, and I felt the small shock in their faces like a physical thing. Kaylee's eyes flashed like she hadn't been told no before. She leaned in and said low, venomous, "You'll regret this. You always do." I handed her a towel. "Then you'll regret the choices you made to get here," I said. Not loud, not theatrical, surgical. By month 5, my role at the telecom had been upgraded to an account administrator with limited authority for activations and suspensions. The work was tedious and exacting and, finally, perfectly useful. I could place holds, require deposits, flag accounts for high risk. I could read the history of a household and see the pattern of repeated late payments and suspicious multiple activations. The system I'd been taught to trust as a neutral machine suddenly felt like a tool I could use, not to spite them for the sake of cruelty, but to prevent them from repeating the thing they always did: use me as their sugar tap. I rehearsed the moves in my head like chess. If they called and screamed about a disconnected phone, I would be calm because I would have already documented the arrears, the failure to provide identity, the lack of acceptable deposit. If they tried to walk into the office and demand reinstatement, security would have the paperwork to refuse them because I had already registered a harassment flag. The revenge I planned wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. It was removal of access. It was a boundary given the force of a system. The breaking point came on a slow Tuesday when Mason had a fever and I had a client call at noon. Dad texted a short paragraph. "We need rent. Wire the money. Kaylee's shoot got postponed. Again. You know how this works." I looked at the thread and then at the file I kept. It had grown weight, dates, amounts, promises, and photos of their outward displays of luxury. I set my phone down and breathed deep and steady, and then I replied, "I'm not sending anything. I'm building a life I can keep without rescuing yours." That small sentence was the end of a line I had drawn a long time ago, but never let solidify. Within an hour, my phone rang with the familiar combination of entitlement and anger. Dad's voice was an animal. "You can't do this. One phone call and everything is gone." I let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then I said slowly, like reading instructions, "If you call to demand money again, I will file for protections and inform your providers you no longer grant access to my accounts. You will have to show proof and make a deposit. That's their policy. I have the authority to enforce it. I am not their ATM anymore." On the other line, he scoffed and told me I was overreacting. He accused me of theatrics. He invoked family and honor and every hollow thing they used to shame me. He threatened in the way abusers think a threat equals control. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid that his anger would undo me. I felt something like relief. The relief of someone who finally understands the rules of engagement in a system they once thought they had no control over. I documented the call. I uploaded the screenshots. I filled out the forms for harassment flags and account denial. I used the system the way it was meant to be used, by the book, administrative, unspiced. It was civilized. It was boring. It was the kind of revenge that would not make them gasp for public spectacle, but would stop the leak that paid for their lifestyle. When their phone lines started to face holds for missing documentation and overdue balances, when the account system required deposits they couldn't show at a moment's notice, they called me frantic, pleading, humiliatingly small. I listened. I didn't act on impulse. I followed policy. I told them what they needed to submit: identity proof, proof of address, refundable deposits. I referenced company procedures I'd learned by heart. It felt clinical and fair and just. At first, they tried to charm employees in other departments. They tried to sweet-talk the front desk at my building with excuses and fake stories. All of those moves failed because every step they took required confirmation beyond the shaky stories they told. They were used to cash and manipulation, not paperwork and policy. One night, Kaylee begged at my doorstep in the rain, mascara tracks like tributaries on her cheeks, voice breaking. "Please, just this once," she begged. "We're drowning. Don't make them look like fools." I stood in the doorway in my plain cardigan, wet along the hem, and watched her like I had been doing for months. Her hands trembled. Her ask was rehearsed. "No," I said then. "You had chances. I kept filling your holes. I'm done." She left, stumbling into the night, and for the first time, the sound of her heels on wet pavement was my liberation. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I didn't post anything. I simply processed the paperwork, checked the boxes, and let systems do the rest. Weeks of denied auto-renewals, repeated identity requests, and deposit holds became the new normal for them. They could not call me at the drop of a hat and expect the free bandage I had always applied. The lifeline that had been mine to give was no longer theirs to pull. The revenge had a slow burn. It wasn't loud, it was structural. It taught them what happens when the person they relied on chooses to become the person who enforced the rules instead of the person who always covered for them. It wasn't about punishment as spectacle. It was about making access unavailable, and that lack of access changed everything. He called me 1,000 names that winter: coward, ungrateful, daughter of a fool. But none of them landed the way his hands had. The calls started polite at first, then frantic, then the thin, practiced anger they used when charm failed. "Come help us," my mother pleaded in one voicemail, voice threaded with alarm and the old entitlement. "We have nothing left." I had the list ready. I had the files. I had the policy codes and deposit requirements memorized the way other people recited prayers. When they begged the carrier for reinstatement, the rep asked for proof: identity, address, refundable deposit, exactly what the system required. They couldn't produce it. They had spent years spending like someone else would hold the tab. The system asked for receipts, bank statements, verification. Their answers were gestures and excuses. Gestures and excuses didn't open accounts. They came to the building one afternoon, faces weathered and small, and security walked them straight out because I'd lodged the flags I needed. There was no dramatic scene, no public unmasking. There was a clerk handing them a printed list of requirements and a security guard telling them politely they weren't authorized to enter. Humiliation looked like paperwork and process, and they hated it more than any shouting match. Kaylee showed up at my door with a tiny cardboard box of things she'd borrowed, a kind of apology that doubled as the last thread of a life she'd built on other people's work. She held the box like it weighed more than it was. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time her voice wasn't rehearsed. It broke. I didn't soften. I took the box, set it on the hall table, and watched her go. Months later, when I signed the lease for the small place that finally felt like mine, the agent slid the keys across with a neutral smile. I walked through the empty rooms and thought of gravel and cheap motel lamps and all the tiny humiliations that had been my life. I set Mason's small dinosaur figure on the windowsill and watched how the sun hit its plastic scales. He climbed onto my knee and looked up at me with the kind of trust that had survived everything. They texted, they called, they sent relatives. Cries of desperation echoed through streets I didn't walk anymore. At one point, my father came to the edge of the park where Mason was learning to kick a ball. He stood a few dozen yards away, hands in his pockets, watching. He mouthed something that might have been an apology or a demand. I couldn't tell. My son ran past him laughing, and I caught the arc of the ball. I walked across the field to the swings and sat down, Mason climbing into the next seat without hesitation. When I pushed him, his feet reached for the sky in the small, perfect rhythm of a child who didn't know about ledgers and loyalties and gravel. My father watched until the light left him and then turned away. I didn't go after him. I didn't ring him back. I pushed the swing harder and let Mason's laughter fill the space where their rules used to be. Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video.